Today's episode of the StallSide podcast was brought to you by Rood Riddle Veterinary Pharmacy.
Bart, how you doing?
I'm well. How are you today, Peter?
Good, thanks. We're going to do something a little bit different this week.
We are, yeah. We've had some very popular episodes, and we're going to revisit one of those.
Absolutely. It was way back episode number 9 with Dr. Scott Morrison.
That's right. One of our more popular guests on, which we'll be hearing more from Scott in the future, but we thought we'd revisit this one.
Yeah, this is great. A great talk about the work he does and about the equine hoof. So looking forward to revisiting this one as a springboard to what he brings us next.
I agree.
So this week on StallSide, we revisit Dr. Scott Morrison talking about podiatry. Scott, welcome to StallSide.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome, Dr. Morrison. Glad to have you.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I was born in Long Island, New York. My father was a mounted police officer, and my mother managed a thoroughbred training farm and galloped horses. And, we grew up in a horsey kind of family. My parents both rode in the rodeo in Long Island. You'd be surprised to know there was a rodeo in Long Island. And both competed. My mom competed in the hunter jumpers, and my dad competed with Western reining and roping, a little bit of everything.
That is actually quite surprising for Long Island, New York.
Yep.
And you said your mom competed in hunter, not associated with the rodeo, though.
No. Now, when I was really young, there was a rodeo in Long Island where my parents, we kept horses there. It was our fairgrounds, and my mom did like an Annie Oakley kind of halftime show, and my dad did some calf roping. And then when I was younger, my parents got divorced, and my mom went off and took a job at a thoroughbred training farm in Long Island, New York. It was quite a big farm for Long Island. There used to be a lot of farms in Long Island. It's changed a lot since then. But it was kind of a horsey community where we grew up.
Gotcha.
Yep.
So what's the rodeo now? Is it a Walmart or what is it?
It's something like that, yeah. It's kind of sad to drive past there. It's all built up and gone.
Yeah, urbanization, not always a good thing. Yeah. So what drew you to podiatry? This must be a long story.
Yeah, well, I've always been fascinated watching farriers work. I've always enjoyed when they came to the farm. They were always quite the characters when they came to the farm. And I thought they had a cool job. They got to bang on steel and hang out in barns all day and shoe horses. And it's always interested me. I've always been fascinated by the process, how they can help horses and just the work of it all just really interested me. And then, I've always been impressed with the veterinarians when they came to my farm as well, and I've always looked up to them, and we always relied on them. And I thought they were just really neat jobs. You spend your day in barns and working on horses all day and just looked perfect to me. So I always had the idea of wanting to do both.
Mm-hmm. So you had some farrier experience before you became a veterinarian, though, right?
Yeah. I went to horseshoeing school in 1989, 1990, around there, in Martinsville, Virginia, Danny Ward's. That was when I was starting undergrad as well. And then I started my own shoeing business in Blacksburg, Virginia, and shod for probably 6 years before I went to veterinary school. And then went to veterinary school and continued shoeing horses up to the second year. I realized, being a student with everyone in my class was very smart. And when you're on the curve, I realized I could not shoe horses and study. I had a rude awakening the first year. The very first test I took in veterinary school, I got almost the lowest grade in the whole class. I remember it was embryology, and I was shoeing horses, a lot. I had a pretty good business, had nice clients, and I was trying to keep it all going.
Yeah.
And that first test, the next day, I called all my clients, and I had to stop shoeing and be a student. I had to get serious about being a student. Yeah. Undergrad was, that was pretty easy. Vet school was a whole nother can of worms.
Yeah.
So of all the places you could have gone with your experience shoeing and your desire to actually do a little bit more as a veterinarian and apply that to podiatry, what brought you to Lexington, Kentucky?
Yeah, well, the caseload and the number of horses. I also had an idea that maybe I wanted to be a surgeon as well. The good thing about veterinary medicine, there were so many options. Now, I could do podiatry, I could be a general practitioner, maybe do surgery, whatever. So I came here to get surgery experience. I took an internship in-house with the surgery and medicine. And it didn't take me long to figure out I didn't really want to do surgery. I liked watching the lamenesses, but I really wanted to be out in the field. working on horses. And I really missed shoeing horses, and I wanted to combine both things. I always joke, I've always felt like I've been grooming myself to be a great veterinarian my whole life, and I figured I would start at the foot and slowly work my way up to all the body systems, and someday be like a James Harriet, just to be a great all-around kind of vet. And
still on the foot though, right?
Yeah. 21 years later, I'm still on the foot. So
stuck at the coronary band.
Yeah, haven't made it to the vet log yet. So.
Yeah, well,
I think this is where I'm going to reside.
Yeah, well, it's to the benefit of us all that you have stayed there. So, who are your influences that drove you to podiatry? Because this is a very specialised thing, and it's a very small pool of people. So who are your influences, and what did you draw upon to get to where you are now?
Yeah, there's really, through undergrad, and there's really no veterinarian except, Dr. Redden was the one we'd see, reading in the magazines and really just his magazines and articles. There wasn't a whole lot of internet or anything else back there to see, or videos. But so I always read about what he was doing, was always very interested. I did have some advisors in veterinary school, like Scott Pleasant he was a trained farrier as well as a surgeon, so he was an influence as well, I'd say. But I would say it was just mostly farriers I met along the way and veterinarians that really, really kind of made me make up my decision and really influenced me to do both.
Shoeing a horse is a very hands-on, almost artistic type of thing. But with what you're doing with podiatry, you're actually bringing a lot of science. Where is the science? Where is this recorded? Who was doing the work? How much of it was actually out there when you began? Because you've had quite a storied career to this point, and we look on you as somebody that's leading this. How did you build your foundation of knowledge to get to where you are?
Yeah, it's kind of piecemealing together a whole bunch of, every piece of information you can find. I feel like there's always been a disconnect between research when it comes to podiatry. And there's a lot of research out there and facts if you find it, but then implementing it and bringing it into practice, I felt like there was always a big gap there. There was farriers and veterinarians, and there were researchers. I felt like it wasn't really all coming together. So that's something I really tried to focus on throughout my career, is trying to read just try to get as much information as I could from reading any kind of scientific journals, anything. I would just skim through the glossary or the first couple pages of journals, make sure any foot stuff, I'd save it, photocopy it, read it, file it, and I would try to just make it all, put it all together slowly over time.
So what did you pick up? Especially from the deep archives, is there stuff way back in the history that, maybe had fallen out of favor that we're using now today?
Oh yeah, a lot of the shoeing modalities and shoeing techniques, and even the treatments we've used, you could look far enough back in the old veterinary textbooks or the old farrier textbooks. And you can find a lot of the shoes we use nowadays, back in the old days, back in the 1800s, 1700s. You look far enough back, you could find almost most of the shoes we use now. So, there's really a lot of information in the past that I think kind of maybe got forgotten about. I think years ago in veterinary school there was a farriery emphasis, and I think somewhere along the way when horses weren't used as much, they kind of fell out of the curriculum. A lot of the farrier science and foot science fell out of the curriculum. And I think a lot of that knowledge was somewhat lost to some degree.
No, that's a good point. And because horses are used different now than they were before, I think a lot of that has fallen out. But talk about, one thing that fascinates me is, I don't know what you call it, larval therapy. Is that what we're calling it nowadays?
Oh yeah, sterile maggot therapy. Yeah.
So talk about that one. How did we start using that? And
yeah, well, that's been used for a very long time. The Mayans used it. It was an old treatment, back in the Civil War and for generations and generations. But I noticed they were using it. I was sitting home one day watching a show on the Discovery Channel, watching them out of Great Britain. They were treating diabetic patients with non-healing foot ulcers, and they were using larval therapy. And I was sitting, on my couch watching that. I was like, wow, I could really use that on some of my foot cases. I remember that was early 2000s when that might have been 2002 or so when I saw that. And right away, I got on the phone the next day, and I started calling. There's no internet, or I wasn't really Googling back then.
Yeah.
I started calling universities' entomology departments, and finally came across the University of California in Irvine. I came across a Dr. Sherman who used, he was raising larval and maggot therapy for use in humans. And I got in contact with him, and he was kind of excited about me using them on horses, and I got my first batch, and I used them, and I quickly put them in the first non-healing foot infection I came across, and the horse did beautifully, did really well. It was funny because I was actually afraid to use them. Yeah, Kentucky's pretty traditional, and I was a young podiatry guy, and I remember the first farm I used them at, I told him it was special medicine. I didn't tell him it was maggots. And because this was a case that was, it was a very good broodmare, and she had a really bad foot infection. Just nobody can get it to heal up. It's been debrided multiple times. It was different types of antibiotic concoctions put in there. And she was starting to founder on the other foot because we couldn't get this one foot infection healed. And that's the mare I put him in. She was a very good mare. She had multiple grade 1 stakes winners, and a couple of her offspring or stallions. And it healed that mare. And I remember when I put him in the first day, I told him it was special medicine, and I didn't tell him it was maggots. And I remember doing the first bandage change. I'm trying to change the bandage without them seeing, and these maggots are falling out, and I'm like, oh, jeez. But eventually I told them I put maggots in there, and they thought it was great. But now they're pretty commonly used in Kentucky and in a lot of different types of foot infections.
Yeah,
they're very, very useful.
One of the most surprising things of that story is you had enough time to sit and watch television and see the Discovery Channel, because you'd have to be one of the hardest working guys that I know. Another thing you actually bring in there about knowledge that sort of was lost and sort of came round again, for me, what I do, right, I see all these horses have got bad colitis, have got bad pneumonias, and cryotherapy, as we call it, or icing. Now, you talk to the old guys, just go stand the horse in the river. And when I first got to this country and started doing the medicine thing late 90s, it was all about putting nitroglycerine on the digital vessel. And everybody was very much against this. Oh, it causes ischemia, shutting the blood supply down by making them cold. And yet now that's probably one of the most impactful things that we do. So walk us through cryotherapy, why it was in, why it was out, and why it's back again.
Yeah. I think probably in the old days it was in because they probably noticed it was mostly, palliative. The horses probably felt good, standing in a cool creek with the mud, giving them foot support. Mm-hmm. And, some horses got better with that. They probably didn't do it as diligently and as strictly as we do it now. I mean, now there's research showing that cryotherapy used consistently for, 72 hours in near freezing water, around 5 degrees Celsius, has a protective effect in the early prodromal stages of laminitis. So, before a horse starts showing foot signs, when they're at high risk of developing laminitis, we start icing them. And that can prevent or significantly decrease the pathology that occurs when if they do get laminitis. And there's some evidence showing if you do it in the acute phase, when the horse just starts to show foot pain, that's the definition of the acute phase. They start getting a pulse and start getting a little bit footsore. If you ice those horses as well, there's some evidence showing that might be effective as far as decreasing the damage that's done.
But back to Peter's first statement, is there a time that it's contraindicated?
For icing?
Yeah.
I think it helps mostly with the horses with like systemic inflammatory, like the infected uteruses or pneumonia or colitis. I think those are the ones it seems to help the most. There's no evidence showing that it would help with like a supporting limb laminitis. Mm-hmm. I mean, that might be an ischemic event. When horses are fully weight bearing on one foot, you can look at perfusion studies. When they're fully bearing weight on one leg, there's very little blood flow, particularly to the lamina and the toe. And it's that's just an adaptive mechanism as horse. It's part of their shock absorbing mechanism. Probably too much to go into now. But when horses are fully weight bearing, there's very little blood flow to the lamina. So I doubt icing would help those horses. No evidence showing it would help those horses.
You've brought up a really interesting point, because everybody seems to look at laminitis as laminitis as laminitis. But you've just sort of said, basically, there's differences. So could you walk us through how you understand the different sort of precipitating events for laminitis, how the processes may be different, and whether you consider there's one unifying theory and one final pathway for horses that have laminitis that we could try to modify?
That's a good question. There's multiple different ways horses can get laminitis. So you have this delicate tissue that holds the coffin bone to the hoof wall. And that tissue can be insulted many ways. I mean, one way is you decrease blood supply to it. All tissue needs blood supply. That's one way of compromising that tissue. So supporting limb laminitis, like we talked about, that's one pathway they can get laminitis. The one is like horses with a major infection or inflammation somewhere else in their body. That's a different type of laminitis. So where the lamina are getting plenty of blood flow, they're probably getting insulted by some turn on of some enzymatic or destructive enzymatic activity. So metalloproteinases is one of the things we hear about. And there's some unknown mechanism with horses that have systemic inflammatory disease. The metalloproteinases in their lamina will get turned on kind of in an unregulated way, and it'll basically just melt down the lamina. They'll just let go and let loose. And those are scary cases because those tend to be, they happen fairly quickly. Like they can rotate or sink within hours. You know, they don't all read the book. Some could be days, but it can happen very quickly. It's like a meltdown of the lamina. Those are scary cases. And then there's the third call would be the endocrine kind of cases, the metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, or the Cushing's horses. And that's probably it's probably a third different way that those lamina get compromised. You know, those horses could be, they have a high insulin levels. High insulin levels could have effects on the endothelium of the vasculature of the lamina. That's one way, so it may affect blood flow to the lamina. There's also high insulin levels also maybe affect the way the basal cells of the lamina communicate with each other, and they can kind of reproduce in a very unorganized way and create a lamellar wedge. It's kind of this hyperproliferation of dysfunctional tissue. So those horses are a little bit more like insidious, and they're a little more slow onset. That this kind of happens slowly over time. It's not like you may notice them just being sore one day, but the process has been going on usually for, I'd say, weeks, months, sometimes years, and just slowly reaches a point where they get sore.
So those laminitis cases are really tough. And when I watched you first start with this, I had experience with a few laminitis mares, and they were hard to watch because we didn't save all of them. We save more now. But how did you deal with because for me that was emotionally taxing as a veterinarian dealing with a laminitis horse, knowing when to stop, when the kindest thing to do is stop. Can you talk about your progression with that, how you dealt with that emotionally, and have your thoughts and your approach to that changed over the last 20 years?
Okay. How we deal, laminitis is a very painful disease, very painful process, and it can be difficult to see those horses sometimes. A couple things that helped me mentally is knowing, first of all, you can't force horses to heal, you can only help them to heal. So I used to take every foundered horse I lost and just carry it on my shoulder for years and years and years until I realized, we don't make horses heal, we kind of help them heal. So some of it's, some other forces involved besides just us. And then the other thing is, pain is part of the rehabilitation process. That's kind of hard to swallow sometimes, but anytime we get hurt, pain is part of our body telling us we need to, take care of that tissue and not overload it. So, pain is part of the rehabilitation process as long as they're healing. So, pain plus healing, rehabilitation. If you have pain with no signs of healing, that's suffering probably, Gotcha. So that's something that helps me in my mind. So what that leads us to do is, how do we monitor these horses and determine whether they're healing or whether they're not healing, and we're just making them suffer. And that takes experience. That takes a lot of diagnostic modalities or things we can use like, radiographs and venograms, and sometimes you gotta just have a lot of experience and a lot of numbers under your belt to look for signs of healing. Sometimes signs of healing could be difficult to detect. So.
Gotcha. So you talked about some of the imaging modalities. What's different for you now? What do you have at your fingertips now that you didn't have, that you have now in summer of 2021 that you didn't have back in 2002?
Yeah. I'd say the number one thing that's been helpful for us is digital radiography. So that's number one. Number two, I'd say venograms. Venograms have become common and very helpful as long as you know how to interpret them. Other things, the biological agents we use, stem cells, PRP, for laminitis in particular, and then, other biological agents for other diseases as well. So digital radiography, just to go back, that was, before, you'd have a horse with laminitis. Someone, or a veterinarian or a referring veterinarian would send you an X-ray of it, and you would, and you'd make a shoe and go shoe the horse and put it on. Some of those horses would get better, some wouldn't. We would think, horse has rotation. We wedge them up, do things to unload the pull of the tendon, give them foot support. Some of those horses got better and some didn't. But I think over the years we've gotten really good at using digital radiography to, because it's so accessible now. We can put shoes on in a certain way, rather than just taking a foot, putting a shoe on, cookbooking it. This horse has this disease, we put this shoe on. Now we do things radiographically, aligning things and balancing things, and putting our shoe on in a certain way in relation to the position of the coffin bone. So digital radiography has helped a lot with that. I mean, before when I first came here, we were developing our films and coming back to the clinic.
Yeah.
I mean, we'd shoot radiographs, come back to the clinic and develop them, and then doing a foundered horse like that was a bit tough. I'd shoe a horse, I'd shoot a radiograph of it, and I'd use that same radiograph when I came back a month later, because you really couldn't go back to the clinic every single time. And I remember I used to carry a little spiral notebook with me with every foundered horse I did and all the radiographic measurements on there. I'd measure. I still have the spiral notebook in my office, but I'd have every horse, every case I had, and I'd measure their palmar angle, their sole depth, and all these parameters, and I'd try to go back and next time and try to shoe the horse, according to those. But now I have digital radiography at my fingertips. I can shoot a picture before, I can put the shoe on, I can take another radiograph, check it. I don't like it, I can tweak it. That's helped quite a bit.
So we need that notebook to put in our museum, right next to Dr. Rood's.
El Camino.
Dr. Riddle's El Camino and Dr. Rood's ultrasound machine that's bigger than the El Camino.
And my little spiral notebook,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, this is an archive, man. This is good.
Can you describe a venogram, what that is, and how that helps you? And for those watching on the YouTube channel, we'll throw one of these a picture of one of these up so you can see it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so a venogram is where we put a tourniquet on at the horse's fetlock, and we inject a radio opaque, dye basically into the blood vessels of the horse's foot. So the dye, the material we use, it's an iodinated compound that we inject into the vessels of the foot, and then you shoot a radiograph, and it gives you a outline of all the blood vessels and all the perfusion to the horse's foot. So it's a lot more sensitive than just a plain radiograph for detecting compromised areas of the foot. So, a lot of times you'll see venographic changes way before you see radiographic changes.
Gotcha.
And then when you have a horse with a bad venogram and you're treating it, sometimes you'll see the venogram improve before you see radiographic signs of improvement. So it's just another degree of
helps a lot with prognosis.
Prognosis, yep. How aggressive to be treating.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Going back to the river, right? We talked about cryotherapy, and you talked about mud providing support, and you touched a little bit just before on sort of shoeing and support material. Walk us through that sort of progression from shoeing to support material, and talk about hoofcasts, because I can watch you guys put hoofcasts on all day. They're such an artistic thing. They're very complex. Walk us through what the advantages of a hoofcast is if you need to get to that point. But what's the thought process that goes into a horse needing one?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, when horses, we use hoofcasts for some types of laminitis, particularly horses that are sinking, like in their, when you think of a horse with laminitis, most of us are familiar with a horse that rotates. The bone, pulls away from the toe of the hoof wall. But there's also horizontal plane laminitis. Horses can sink a little bit, either to the medial quarter, because there's lamina that circumscribe the whole entire hoof. So they can sink to the medial quarter or lateral quarter, or they can just sink straight down as well. So, that's a very tough disease to manage, because if you back up to the horses that rotate, that's mostly, the lamina and the toe are compromised, and it's the pull of the tendon that's pulling on the coffin bone that tears that lamina when it's compromised. And there are things you can do shoeing-wise to battle tension. So you're dealing with tension of the deep digital flexor tendon against the weakened lamina, and we do things like we elevate the heel, move the breakover point back. All those things are addressed. It's mostly to take tension off the deep digital flexor tendon to unload that diseased lamina in the toe. But when they're sinking in the quarters, you're dealing just with the weight of the horse and gravity. So it's a very problematic, difficult thing to try to mechanically treat. You really can't do much for gravity unless you're going to put the horse in a sling or force it to lie down to heal. Those have their complications. But the one thing that has helped us with these horses that have laminitis in the quarters is the foot cast. And that's because if you ever watch a foundered horse walk, a lot of people always say, he walks pretty good in the straightaway. Once he gets going, he walks good. But then when he turns, he's really sore. That's because that turning really twists and shears the lamina in the quarters. So, it's my theory, horses that are sinking, they have some diseased lamina, And every time they twist and turn, it just propagates that tearing, further around and damages more lamina. If you think of lamina like a fabric, they're basically sheets of fabric. And if you want to tear fabric, you're not going to pull it straight apart. You're going to rip it or shear it. Mm-hmm. That's what horses turning do. When they turn, they're shearing that fabric. So the foot cast, what we do, we put the foot cast on and we make a dome on the bottom of the foot cast. And to me, that makes the whole hoof kind of, when the horse turns and twists, the whole hoof kind of moves as a unit, and they spin on that dome. And it helps take away some of the shear force in the quarters is all it does. It doesn't decrease any weight of the horse down on the leg. The gravity's still there, but it does decrease the shear. And with horses with, a certain amount of lamellar damage, you'll save them that way. I mean, if some horses are just complete meltdowns and their lamina are just letting go everywhere, it's not going to save them. Probably not much you can do to save them. But I think when they have some degree of laminar damage in the quarters and heels, that foot cast is beneficial and effective for those. And we've saved several like that.
Yeah. You mentioned about tension on the pedal bone and trying to relieve tension with the deep digital flexor and with shoeing. Let's say that doesn't work mechanically. Where do you go?
Yeah, well, mechanically, if they're rotating severely and they're through their vasculature and they're through their sensitive corium, their dermis of the sole, the next thing when shoeing mechanics fail would be a deep digital flexor tenotomy, depending on the owner and the client and their goals. That's always an option. That is very effective. It's very effective at, obviously, it decreases tension on the tendon immediately if you cut it. And then you got to combine that with a special shoeing called a derotation or a realignment shoeing. And that can be very effective in treating some horses. You shift, basically when you cut the tendon and do that, you shift the weight from their toe all the way to their heel. Mm-hmm. Horses are toe loaders. If you put a horse on a pressure mat, their center of pressure is more like up towards the apex of the frog. You think you'd be back on the heel looking at them, but if you put them on a pressure mat, they're right around the apex of the frog, maybe slightly behind it. And when you cut their tendon, you shift the center of pressure to further back in the foot. And, it has complications too, because like we talked about earlier, some horses have laminitis in their quarters and heels. So if you have a horse that's rotating and you don't really know how healthy his lamina are in the quarters and heels and you do a tenotomy, sometimes they can start sinking a little bit in the medial or lateral quarter. So you're just shifting the load. You're not taking the load away, you're just shifting it to a different area of the foot, and you got to hope that part of the foot holds up.
There's a lot of art involved in that science.
Yes. Yeah.
That is a huge judgment call. Yeah.
There's a lot of complications that and there are a lot of things that have to be done correctly. There are little elements in the details that can be the difference between success and failure. That's for sure.
So Scott, you've solved a lot of problems, or you've helped us solve a lot of problems and helped us manage things a lot different. What's on your mind now? What problem is out there that you're working on that you think, if I can just get here with this, what's next?
To me, the most difficult thing has always been treating the low-heeled foot. Whether it's a racehorse or some other discipline. Treating a low-heeled foot is always difficult. I always found, treating, different types of, there's a good foot, there's an upright, clubby foot, and then there's a low-heeled foot. A lot like we just talked about with laminitis. The club foot's mostly tension. It's mostly a contracted flexor tendon that causes the club foot. So, and using different types of shoeing modalities, it's easier to treat tension than it is to treat the forces of gravity, Yeah. So in low heel, it's basically you're battling the forces of gravity on a conformation that's making that horse load his heel, and that's a very difficult thing to try to treat. So you're just left with trying to help that horse grow the strongest, healthiest heel possible, because you're not going to change his conformation. You think of a low-heeled horse, long sloping pastern, maybe sloping shoulder. Maybe you just can't help but load his heel the way he's built. So we're left with trying to just help that horse, build a strong heel that can accommodate those forces. And that's using different types of shoeing modalities, again, support and
Gotcha.
Taking stress off the heel in different ways.
Does sole support have anything to do with those horses developing low heels? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I think, anytime you put a horseshoe on a horse's foot, just take a look at a fairly normal U-shaped horseshoe. Anytime you put that on a horse's foot, you stress their heel. I mean, you do make them get a little bit lower in the heel, a little bit underrun in their heel. The heels want to migrate forward. So the horse that has the healthiest heel is usually a barefooted horse, because the loading, the way that foot's loaded is the most natural. I mean, the frog is bearing weight, the bars are bearing weight, a little bit of the sole is bearing weight. When you put a horseshoe on a horse's foot, you make the perimeter hoof wall bear all the weight, and you deprive those axial structures in the middle of the foot from bearing weight, and you really can stress the heels and make them get lower and more underrun. So what we try to do is realizing that barefoot horse has a nice healthy heel, and we also realize some horses need shoes, we try to mimic the barefoot condition the best we can with shoes. So that's where sole support materials come in. There are different density sole support materials just to help mimic that barefoot condition. Horses are probably meant to have their feet packed with mud, be barefoot, and that provides a lot of natural sole support. And so we try to mimic that with sole support materials, and sometimes bar shoes or heart bar shoes to help the foot behave like a normal, healthy, natural foot.
Gotcha. Because I think of it a little bit like my own shoes, right? They do make me perform better. I'm not as sensitive, and I think horses are a lot the same way. But at the same time, I don't go to bed with the same pair of shoes on and wear them for 30 days at a time.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably a lot the same for
it is a lot of it. Yeah, a lot of our horses have to compete, sleep, rest, and eat in the same set of shoes. So, yeah. I do think somewhere down the road, particularly like in race horses and horses that have a lot of stress on their heel, I do think we'll have. I envision somewhere down the road horses having like removable frog supports on their shoes, or maybe removable orthotics, or something to give them some arch support while they're just standing around and resting, and then you can take that stuff off and compete. I think down the road that'll be. Removable heart bar shoes or removable frog support devices will be something that'll, I think someday will become fairly normal and commonly used.
Maybe Under Armour will come up with the Morrison line or something.
Yeah. Pretty much. Or the Barber line of nighttime shoes, because it sounds like you're not wearing the same shoes to bed, implying that you are wearing shoes to bed. No. This is more than information I needed to know. So tell us, what does a day look like for Scott Morrison? Walk us through your day.
My day. I wake up about 5:30. I feed my dog, let my dog out, and then I get ready to go to work. Sometimes my dog comes with me. Sometimes she stays home. I give her the option. Mm-hmm. I don't expect the same out of everybody. I do that of myself. And she does. She'll go outside, check the weather, and if it's hot, she won't go to work. Anyway, and then I go to get a Starbucks. I got to start with a Starbucks or a strong coffee every morning, and then I'll go to my first farm call, usually around 7 o'clock. I try to be on my first farm, and it's a mixture. I do farm calls, and I have in-house cases, so it's hard. We're running back and forth, and we have horses all over town. We go from every side of Lexington, so 45-minute swing from each farm to the other sometimes. But I try to line things up where we can, do things where all the farms I'm doing that day are close to each other. And it's coming back to the clinic, working on some horses that have hauled in. The farm work mostly is, we do everything really. We do foals, yearlings, stallions, brood mares, just any kind of foot problems or conformational problems, emergencies, infections. And then the surgeons we usually call sometime in the middle of the day with a lameness exam they worked up that may have either a foot lameness or a foot-related lameness, or maybe a horse that just had an MRI the day before that needs some attention. So we'll get pulled into the clinic a few times during the day. And then usually around, we try to wrap up around 5 or 6, or come into the clinic at 5 or 6 and look at our hospitalized patients around 5 or 6. And then I try to get home around 6 o'clock at night, and I try to ride 1 or 2 horses every night. I try to make sure I do something besides work, and I do try to make sure I ride almost every night. So I enjoy doing that.
Yeah, well, I'm guilty of getting you guys in about 9 o'clock at night sometimes.
Yeah, I purposely left out the medicine phone call that I get around 12 o'clock, saying it's in isolation and you have to come at the end of the day. You can't when all my other cases are done.
But hey, we couldn't do it without you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what does the future hold for Scott Morrison?
Ooh. I think I'll be at Rood Riddle doing podiatry for a while. Probably, I don't know, 65, 70. I'd like to, I don't know. I just want to just want to stay, I want to stay active. I like to, I like doing the work I do. I like working as much as I like working almost as much as I do now. I'd like to someday maybe work a little bit less. I always joke, I say I work half the day because I love it. I work the second half of the day because I have to. So when I can get to where I work half of the day and then take off and do something else, that'd be nice. But I think I'll always be doing podiatry until I just can't anymore.
Shoot till you drop.
I think I'll shoot till I drop, yeah.
Do you have a favorite case or an accomplishment that sticks out for you?
God, I don't really have one in particular, to be honest. I mean, I have so many in years past, and now just, we get to work on a large array of different types of cases, from the backyard horse to, famous horses. And, sometimes the ones that stick out to me the most is just the backyard horse that someone hauled down here 3 hours away. And, the horse had bad laminitis and you treated it, and the horse now has a fairly normal life, and they're riding it again. I mean, those cases, you always, you just can't help to think about them, a couple times a week, we're just wondering how they're doing now, and how lucky you were that you got to work on those horses. And then, you work on the high level horses too, and they're great and they're fun, and they keep you motivated, but they have their own level of stress associated with them as well. But I get joy out of all of them. I mean, I like watching good race horses or good anything, jumpers or Western pleasure or Western horses, or I like watching horses compete after we've helped them. I love that. I mean, I do like working on the athletes. But then I like watching a horse that had a serious problem and now has a fairly normal life after we've treated them. So I can't say there's one particular case. I mean, I get fired up about. I like a lot of different cases. I like podiatry. I mean, it sounds probably very mundane, maybe, or maybe more boring to some people. You're just working on feet all day long. How do you do that? But I see such variety in it, and I see a lot of different types of cases and a lot of different clients, a lot of horses that do a lot of different things. And for me, it keeps me very motivated, and it still excites me. So I don't think I'll get above the fetlock anytime soon. I'm going to stay in the foot for a while. It still fires me up.
Still planning to go there. Well, no hoof, no horse, right?
That's right.
And so much of what we do is dependent on what you do, because if I might fix the primary problem, but if it's walking out of its feet, we're still lost.
Yeah.
So
that's a sad story when they overcome so much. And then they got to.
Yeah, and that's hard for us to watch too. So we really appreciate what you guys do.
No, and as a practitioner who's dealing with something, it's so much better now that we can turn these things over to you guys and have the expert care, and the advances that have been made are unreal. We're saving so many horses now that we weren't before you took this on. So it's very appreciated. You and your entire group done a lot for the horse and the industry. Yeah,
we have a lot of good people work with us, so we're very fortunate.
Yeah, and you're really generous with your knowledge too, and it's made a big difference, not just in this town, but everywhere. Everywhere you go, people talk about you guys because of how you've helped them out.
Yeah, that's good.
Great. Well, thanks for coming to see us today.
All right. Well, thanks for having me.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it. I think it's been a great conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that's StallSide for today. We were talking to Dr. Scott Morrison, a podiatrist at Rood Riddle. See you next time.